Yo, I just came up with an awesome idea. I'm just gonna pause and ruminate, think about it, because I want to be able to express this in the future. So I'm gonna come up with this idea, which is, if you do something bad, how cruel you are depends on who you sell it to. That is loud dog. Loud doggo. Okay, let's say you make a product, but it's like destructive. It hurts someone or destroys habitat, and you sell it to somebody. The cruelty of your action depends on who you sell it to. If you sell it to whether you're deceiving the person buying it is a completely separate matter. We're not going to talk about that. If you sell it to somebody who's too naive to know that what you did has consequences, then you are more cruel than if you sell it to somebody who knows exactly what you did to make that product. But you, from your perspective, you don't have the information. So you don't actually know how cruel you're being unless you, like, lie to the buyer, which is a separate matter. But so the interesting thing is, without knowing who you're selling to, you become more or less cruel based on how naive that person is. And that's because there's a finite amount of cruelty when an evil deed is committed, because the cruelty is based on how knowing you are. So the first priority, there's three layers of priority for cruelty. One is the consumer. Two is I guess there's also the category. So in the category of a consumer-driven society, a consumer-driven economy, there's three layers. One is the consumer. They're to blame. But if they don't, if maybe they don't know how to speak English, they're 5 years old, they don't know that meat is made from animals, or they don't know that driving cars pollutes. So they don't know. Someone's buying them dog food and the dog doesn't know that it's dog food. They think it's falling from the heavens, the meat they're eating. So they're the unwitting victim. Then they're the unwitting predator. The unwitting predator, the unwitting exploiter. Not like intentionally ignorant, not like willfully stupid, but just they don't know better because they've never had the chance to learn. That is the first priority of blame. So they but if they're too unwitting, then the cruelty defaults to the person doing it. So the person in the slaughterhouse actually doing the slaughtering, or the person in the mine actually drilling up the place and causing the pollution. But in a consumer-driven society, there's also the third level. So some of the blame goes to the CEO, the person in charge of the company, and some of the blame, I guess, goes to the people in charge of, like, the society's structure and system, in charge of, like, who regulates these industries. Some of the blame goes to them as well, because they're responsible for holding the CEOs accountable, and the CEOs are responsible for holding the workers accountable, and the consumers are responsible for holding the CEOs accountable. So the CEOs and the worker form their own system, and the consumers and the government form their own system called, like, consumerism. And then, no, sorry. The consumers and the government have their own system called democracy. The CEOs in the government have their own system called plutocracy. The CEOs and the workers have their own system called predatory capitalism. And the consumers and the CEOs have their system called consumerism. And the animals and the workers have their system called torture, and the animals and the consumers have a system called predation, and I guess the animals and the government have a system called oversight, and the animals and the CEOs, I guess that would be a system called slavery, because the animals are owned as property. All right, so those are the systems involved in a slaughterhouse. There's similar systems in any creating the raw components for any manufacturing process. There's a system, and there's all these interactions between the consumer, the manual labor, the company, the people who lead the company, and the people who lead the government, or whoever's in charge of oversight for that company and its victims. So the interesting nuance here that I found is, I think, because the first level of cruelty from the consumer, because this is a consumer-driven society we're talking about, where the workers have to work, and the consumers, they're the ones with the free will, because the workers are coerced into working, so they don't actually have as much free will as the consumers. So based on like the free will to choose, the consumers are more to blame, because they're the predators. They're the ones benefiting from this. They're the ones who have the choice whether or not to be exploitative. So, but if the consumer is and there's another level, which is like the parents or the pet owner, right? Obviously, they're the one making the choice. So the person purchasing the product, right, is the consumer. But you could also argue that the consumer is the one receiving the product. So if it's a gift, if you're buying it for a child or a dependent, like a pet, or a adopted child, or I don't know, kids at wherever you work, supervising kids, then I haven't actually thought about this, but obviously if the kids don't know where meat comes from, if the pet doesn't know where meat comes from, then even though they would be evil by consuming it, they are not cruel because they don't know. And the parent or provider of the food, even though they would be cruel by purchasing the product, they're not necessarily evil because it doesn't serve their own interests to provide food for someone else. Or maybe it does, but if it doesn't serve their interests, then I don't think they're as evil as if it benefits them directly. So there's a shared burden of evil. But generally, the person eating the food, I think, would be the most evil. And then, so evil and cruelty are two different things. Cruelty has to do with intent. Cruelty has to do with knowing the consequences of your actions. And not just knowing, but more like, knowing it, like, you don't have to acknowledge the consequences of your actions. They still exist. Once you've like realize, like, you don't have to accept the facts. As long as you know about the facts, then you're a source of cruelty. But the person selling to you, the worker working for the company that sells to you, they don't know who's buying it. So someone that works in a slaughterhouse that only makes baby food or cat food is more cruel than a person who works in a slaughterhouse that makes, like, you know, chicken McNuggets or steak. That's very interesting. I hadn't I hadn't I don't think I don't think anyone really thinks about these things. But that's like very interesting. It's very interesting. If you are paid, if you have to work for a living and you're paid to make baby food and you're the one who kills the chickens or, you know, butchers the beef for the baby food or the cat food or the dog food or the fish food, you are more cruel than someone who makes steaks or chicken McNuggets, because you are selling, or no, because the person who benefits directly from the predation is unwitting or naive. Not naive, like just not knowing. Yeah, naive. Naive has the connotation of like, naive has a different connotation, but yeah, if someone's too young or too stupid to know the consequences of their actions, but like not okay, not like not like fallaciously stupid, just like not that bright, then they are less cruel. So that's cool. I feel like now I'm just repeating myself in a loop, but like, do you agree or disagree? Like, what, or does it default to the parents? Is it is it just as is it just as immoral to butcher animals for baby food as it is to butcher animals for steak? Because you could argue that it defaults to the consumer, which is the parent or the pet owner. So I suppose they would be the ones who are more cruel. Hmm. I guess my example holds true when, like, there's a kid, like a really young kid at a convenience store, and he buys some beef jerky. Then he is less cruel than the parent who gives beef jerky to their 3-year-old, or maybe you shouldn't do that, gives beef jerky to their dog, because the person purchasing the product, I guess, would be the default for the cruelty. But how much trickles down to the worker? I don't. There have got to be cases where people, where, I don't know. I I don't know. These I don't know the answer to these questions, but I'm really, really, really curious. So yeah. And I'm not talking about evil. I'm talking about cruelty, which is like the intent. The intent to cause suffering or knowingly causing suffering, which is different from evil, which is um, being what I think evil is benefiting from suffering. How much does the parent benefit How much does the parent benefit from feeding their kid meat? And how much does the pet owner benefit from feeding meat to their dog? This is an interesting question for vegetarian parents who can't agree with their spouse whether to have their kids go vegetarian. How much does the vegetarian parent benefit from consenting with a meat eater to have their kids be omnivores? I think how much the purchaser benefits affects that trickle down of blame from the consumer to the purchaser to the worker and the company owners. So how much does a pet owner or a parent benefit from feeding someone else meat? And that determines how cruel the worker who makes dog food or cat food or baby food is compared to the worker who makes steak or barbecue ribs or McNuggets. Assuming here that the workers are coerced to do labor through predatory capitalism. Obviously, in a society where everybody has a decent standard of living and minimum wage has kept up with inflation, then I think the workers would be more to blame. Yeah, like meat industry just goes anywhere to hire workers because nobody wants to work in the meat industry, so they go and the CEOs go and import workers illegally and then threaten to deport them if they like demand fair working conditions and pay. So it's not as simplistic as I say it is. But that's what I mean by predatory capitalism. Predatory not as in predation, but predatory as in exploiting workers and coercing workers. So yeah, the blame, I think there's a finite amount of blame and there's a finite amount of evil from when someone over their lifespan suffers a certain amount to create a certain amount of products, because there's a finite amount of suffering over time in someone's life, and then when they die or up until their death, they create a finite amount of products, and you can weight the products by weight, by suffering, etc. So that's I think that's subjective, like because cows produce more than one product. But yeah, that's the stuff I think about.